Hey everybody, this is Matt again with another game analysis from a Just Live game. This game was played fairly recently, and I was playing with the black pieces. The ratings at the time were my opponent, who was John Caesar, 1486 to my 1456. The time controls for this game were 45 minutes for each player, and the game started out with my opponent playing pawn to e4, and I respond with pawn to c5, going into a Sicilian defense. Next game, bishop to c4, and pawn to e6, threatening to at some point move the pawn up to d5 and gain a tempo on the bishop. Next came knight to f3, just development and a preparing a e4 pawn advancement at some point in the game, and I came up with knight to c6, which is now preventing this pawn from advancing to e4. Play continued from here with pawn to c3. This is supporting again this e4 pawn, and now I play knight to f6, which is now declining this pawn to e4 immediately, because now this pawn is being attacked, and the knight cannot develop as it normally would here or here to defend this pawn. And so white now has two options. The first option is to move this pawn to e3, which is kind of going against the attempt to get it to e4, and the other option is to bring this pawn up to e5. In the game, we saw the pawn go up to d3, but another variation that is potential is just the pawn advancing to e5, where, for example, maybe d5 would have come up, the bishop could retreat, and the knight could then retreat down, getting ready to try to win this piece at some point. That's one variation potentially, but that's not what we saw. We end up seeing just d3 come up. And from here, the bishop develops to e7, getting ready to castle on the king side. And now we see the bishop come up to e3 for black, putting some pressure on this pawn. It is defended at the moment, but just getting more pressure on the position. And now we see both sides castle. And now I play pawn to a6, getting ready to advance this pawn to b5, getting a tempo on the bishop. And white prevents this by playing pawn to a4. This puts another defender on this square, and at the same time it is pinning this pawn to my rook if I were to push the b5 pawn up. So bringing the b5 pawn up now is just losing material. Play continues from here with d5 now coming up. We see pawn on e capture on g5, and I recapture with the knight. I do this in hope to maybe win the bishop pair, either by capturing that bishop or by this bishop capturing this knight at some point. Play from here continues with the queen coming up to e2, defending this bishop if it were to be captured, so that the pawn would not have to. From here we see the knight go ahead and capture the bishop as previously mentioned, and now we see the queen recapture, and I'll bring my queen here, threatening this pawn on b2. This gains a tempo on the queen, so now the queen has to move back to defend this pawn. Alternatively, the rook could have come up to defend this pawn. It's kind of a passive move, bringing the rook up to that square. So we just see the queen go back now to defend the pawn. Next we see bishop to f6. This is to do two things. First of all, the bishop was not doing anything on this square. It was just looking at a pawn that is not even being attacked by white. So this is a much more active square. It is putting more pressure on the center, particularly it's putting more pressure on this pawn, as well as it is controlling this knight. A nice little thing about bishops versus knights: if you have a bishop that has 2 squares away from the knight, the bishop is attacking every square that the knight can jump in a forward direction. So this knight cannot jump anywhere without me having the option to capture it. So it really limits the range of this knight. This knight is not going to be able to go anywhere anytime soon safely. So anyway, play from here continues with rook coming over to c1, trying to get the rook a little bit more active. White's kind of trying to predict that there might be a lot of activity focused around this pawn, particularly around these pawns right here. Seeing how this pawn is already being attacked by the queen. The white queen is having the job of defending this pawn at the moment. And this pawn right here is being attacked by the bishop. So these pawns, white is moving this rook over in prediction that these pawns are going to become a focal point at some point of the match. From here, play continues with rook to d8, starting to put more pressure on these pawns. And now we see h3. I think this is here to just give an escape route to the king, maybe. I think maybe that white didn't really see a real productive move to make at the moment, and so just opted to go ahead and give the king a flat square in the event that there are back rank checks later in the match. From here we see knight comes to a5. This goes again with trying to get these bishops, put pressure on the bishops. The only square that this bishop can move to is a2 without being captured. Otherwise, the knight or a pawn can recapture the bishop. And from here, my opponent played a awkward move. My opponent played rook to a3. I'm not really sure what this accomplished. The knight is still being attacked by the. Excuse me. The knight is still being attacked by the. The bishop's still being attacked by the knight. And now, if I capture, the pawns are going to be doubled. So I'm not completely sure what my opponent was trying to accomplish with this rook lift up to a3. But regardless, the knight now captures, and now white has doubled pawns on the c file. From here, play continues with the queen coming back over to c6, and I kind of regretted playing this. The reason I played this, I really wanted to move this pawn up so that the bishop could finally get into some sort of an active square. It's really passive at the moment, and on this diagonal, the queen and bishop would actually be pinning this knight down because there's a mate threat if the knight were to move. So it would be putting a lot of pressure on the white position. But moving the queen allows this knight to develop. While the queen was on b6, the knight was actually pinned to its original square. Moving the knight over resulted in this pawn being lost, since it would block the communication between the queen and the pawn. And the only real way to get out of it was to either advance this pawn or move this rook. So white was going to have to make some moves white was going to have to really work to get this knight into the game. But since I moved this queen, now the knight can just come into the game immediately. And I kind of regretted that after the move was made. Play from here continues with b6. As I was saying, I'm just trying to get this bishop more active and to connect my rooks to complete my development. And from here we see rook to b1, getting ready to start pushing this pawn up. At the moment, this pawn is really a liability. It's a backwards pawn in the position, and it's really not doing anything right now. And white really wants to see this pawn get pushed up and to start being an active piece, and to eventually open up this file for the rook to have activity on. From here we see bishop to b7. This knight is now pinned to the f3 square because there is a mate threat if the knight were to move. From here we see b4. As I said, the rook was just coming in here to support this pawn moving up. and I ignore this, and I get ready to start stacking my rooks on this open file. From here we see the pawn advance again, attacking my queen, and we see some pawn exchanges, and now we see the queen coming up to d5. It took me quite a while to think about where to move the queen. Almost nowhere seemed really that great, but my idea was to bring it to this square so that I could bring it to this square, attacking the rook, and then it is defended by the knight, but my rook could potentially take out this knight if need be. So I'd just be putting pressure on this rook, but then to eventually move the queen back so that I'm maintaining this mate threat on the g2 square. And from here we see c4 attacking my queen. The queen moves over now to f5, and the rook now comes up to b3 and connects the rooks on this file, getting ready to get some activity for them. From here we see the queen just back up into this hole, putting pressure on this pawn yet again. More importantly, I still have this mate threat if this knight moves, but now this pawn is pinned, so this knight is is that much less defended as a result. And I'm going to break this video into two parts, and I'm going to stop this part here, so that's part one, and be sure to watch part two. Thanks.